I love it because it's a school setting. Now here they can actually have somebody physically right there with them, watching them that is a teacher, and having a teacher on the computer. So it's like a win-win situation.
I work from home some days. I will, go into the office some days. It just depends, and I'm blessed to have that flexibility, but I'm not at home every day. So it's important that my daughter has somewhere that she can go and feel safe, and that she will still get the learning that she's supposed to.
I begin to think about kids and what the school does for them. Certainly it's the place where they get an education, but it's also the place where many of those kids eat. It's the place where many kids are referred for a health service, especially for a mental health service. It's the place where children who live in an environment that's not safe for them, it's their safe place to go. And I begin to think about our churches that were at that time, and still mostly are here in Houston, they're closed. And so we have all this space.
When we said, well, what if our United Methodist churches opened up and allow students to come in and have access and provide a loving and encouraging environment, and we can kind of connect with the school district, it'll be like a match made in heaven.
This is like more of a safe environment for her to be around. It's time for me to be back in work. I've been at home working since March, so it's time for me to be back to work. And they offer lunch, they offer breakfast, stretch time, outside time, so this is like perfect for the kids.
The reason why I chose this option for my kids to go to church is because I did not have the internet service and plus the time schedule. So, I can't be with my kids and go to work during the daytime at the same time.
I think some of them would have quit their jobs. I think they would have been out and hustled again looking for some more friends they could, get their kids to stay with. It's just such a heart-wrenching decision to have to make. And I'm sorry that some of them would have had to quit their jobs, because in this environment that we're in now with COVID, there aren't a lot of opportunities. So you got to hang on to what you got.
And Priscilla joins me now. Priscilla, we heard from parents using the program there, the directors. Tell us more about how it works. What a wonderful thing for families who just need to go back to work.
Certainly, Allison, there are a number of initiatives happening across the greater Houston area to help students return to school virtually safely. We're actually in one of the study zones here in Harris County that can accommodate around 150 students. All of these tables about 6 feet apart to ensure that they have the distancing in order to work here and do so safely. There's free Wi-Fi, and you might hear a little hum. If you take a look up there, you can probably see there are gigantic fans here to help keep students cool, because they are going to be outside if they choose to come here, and so that they can be comfortable as they're doing that virtual learning. But we also spent part of the day at those sanctuaries of learning that Houston Independent School District has done in partnership with a number of churches across that area. And what happens there is that each church actually has a site coordinator who works with the schools in that community to identify families who might be in need of that type of learning environment, who do have to physically go into work every day and can't be home with their students to help them with those assignments. And so those students pack up those laptops, they take them into those churches, and we got a peek inside that one where you heard from those parents just a little while ago, and most of the students were divided into classrooms with 3 to 4 students per classroom, still doing their learning virtually, but there was an adult in the room to monitor them, to help them if they needed it. And that is exactly what's key here, and what a lot of the parents that I spoke to were looking for. And that's also going to go a long way for teachers. Back in the spring, I spoke with a number of teachers when virtual learning was first becoming a thing. And some of the challenges that were mentioned to me were that some students didn't have Wi-Fi and so had to work on a phone, or, an older sibling was doing their virtual learning while also watching the younger sibling. So certainly this will help as teachers and parents and students navigate the challenges of a very unconventional school year. Allison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.